The truth is, we are defying the odds in places where progress to many seemed impossible. But every day together, we prove that it isn't. And now I'm getting into the hard part of tonight's conversation, because normally I get up here, like I do whenever I'm asked to speak, and I try to connect a room full of people who may never have personally experienced or been touched by war, that it can and should matter to all of us. And I think, sadly, this evening, those connections no longer need to be made. Who could possibly right now ignore the heartbreak and devastation caused by war and terrorism that we have seen, particularly over the past few months? And then the divisions, the hostilities, the binary thinking, the resentments and rage that war engenders, these have been escalating, and sadly it has infected some here at home. Over the last 2 months, since the brutal terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians and the subsequent loss of life of more than 10,000 civilians in Gaza, I have been asked many times not only what can be done about this situation to help ensure that children especially have the support that they need. I've also been asked, what do we do as a society about the fault lines that this conflict has exposed? The dangerous rhetoric, the acts of hate, the threats, the intimidation. And the truth is, the answer is not as complicated as we might imagine, because in every war-torn environment in which I have ever worked, and it's been almost 30 years now. I started when I was 12. But in every war zone in which I have ever worked, amidst the worst atrocities imaginable, there are always people demonstrating incredible courage. They're the people who show up to protect the most vulnerable, who call out those who spread hate and misinformation, who demonstrate exceptional courage in holding perpetrators to account. They are those who are willing to risk their own lives every day to save others. And they are the voices of reason and compassion in a tornado of despair. And believe me, they exist everywhere. And they are worth investing in. As Adrian mentioned, more than 99% of our staff throughout the world are local to countries in which we are operating, and they are the drivers of change. And they are advancing a profound and compelling alternative to this suffering, to this divisive and rage-filled way of thinking. Take Alfred, who was just up here on the stage. He has led and expanded our catch-up learning programs and other skills training programs for refugee youth across Uganda because he has lived, which he explained, why it matters. And so it's personal for him, just as it is personal for the extraordinary all-African team that he leads. And they are achieving what many of these refugee children once thought impossible. They're making it so that vulnerable kids are back in school, and that youth who need to earn an income have the skills that they need to start a business, and they're supporting one another. And these are kids and young people, refugees who have lost parents to war, who have experienced crushing trauma and abuse, and who now aspire to be doctors and nurses and construction workers and human rights lawyers and entrepreneurs, all the jobs we have in this room, right? And that is what recovery from war looks like. And they are the antidote to the cynicism and paralysis we often feel when we think about war. And by investing in them, as you are this evening by being here and supporting us, we are all collectively investing in a generation, a movement of survivors who are far less likely to be recruited by armed groups, who are less likely to be marginalized and abused, especially women and girls, and who are capable of holding their governments to account and become leaders themselves. They are running aid programs and rebuilding their communities, and they are very clear in their conviction that this ongoing violence that has plagued them and their families has to be stopped. And these are not short-term solutions. That is not what War Child does throughout the world. We are a critical, specialized organization that believes that effective humanitarian aid is never about short-term relief, though there is certainly a time and place for those kinds of efforts. The question, and the one that is often the hardest to answer in any war zone, which is where we step in, is, well, what happens next? What happens after the short-term relief, the business of keeping people alive? What happens when kids have been displaced, when women have experienced systemic sexual violence, when there are no homes and communities to return to? When a generation of children have not had access to education or employment, sometimes even food, because literally everything has been destroyed. That is the space that we operate in. That's the hard stuff, the seemingly impossible stuff, with the most at risk, the most vulnerable. And in that context, when people say to me, well, what does War Child do exactly? Sometimes it's hard to explain, but the answer is pretty simple. All of it. We do all of it, whenever and wherever we can. And in the same way that no one would ever hand out blankets in the middle of a crisis and say, well, that's good enough, we can all go home now. We do not believe at War Child that the answer to helping women and children in the midst of war is ever one thing. It is many things. If there are no schools, then we have to help rebuild them. Not to create facilities that communities cannot maintain over the long term or that are disconnected from the local system, but to ensure that the infrastructure exists for safe learning. And so sometimes that does mean fixing and refurbishing local classrooms, training teachers and teachers' assistants, using makeshift shelters like tents if a permanent structure isn't feasible, and then running catch-up learning programs so that children who have been out of school can rejoin and be set up for success. And we are running those kinds of programs throughout the world in places, as Alfred has mentioned, Uganda, Yemen, Eastern Congo, and other war-torn countries. Sometimes the needs are different because the risk of famine in an environment might be extremely high. And when aid dollars dry up, so do, unfortunately, international food aid distributions, which is why, for example, in South Sudan, and I'll be heading there in a couple of weeks, we are training female farmers, we are helping them to maximize their crop yields in sustainable ways, and we are also helping them earn and control their income, which directly benefits their children. And so this is why the whole question of what do you do doesn't fit into a tidy soundbite. Because simply put, we help children and communities recover from war. We disrupt the cycle, and we do it in a way that promotes sustainability by making sure that those families become more self-reliant, and we do it by building upon what exists, not by creating separate parallel structures. Food, water, shelter, tents, all of those things that are often the business of aid, all of those things can be taken away. But education, hard skills, the capacity to keep earning, none of those things once acquired can be lost to war. Those are forever. And that's what we do, and that is why we do it. And it isn't hopeless, it isn't a long shot, it isn't the case that what we build is constantly being undone. On the contrary, we are making incredible strides. Last year alone, we worked with more than 1.2 million children. And we are limited only by one thing. We are limited by the financial resources we often so desperately need to respond to the growing demand for our programs. And this is an incredibly tenuous time in the world. There have been dramatic changes, for example, to global aid spending over just the past 18 months. First, because of the war in Ukraine, which saw a massive redirection of donor dollars to that crisis, and now as a result of the conflict in Israel and Gaza. And that is not to suggest that those conflicts are not very much in need and worthy of support. But what's happening in other war zones as a result of that is a massive shortfall in humanitarian spending in all other corners of the world. So for example, This is the current funding status of the Global Humanitarian Appeals. Global Humanitarian Appeals is when all the international aid organizations come together and they determine what the risks are, what the humanitarian needs will be, and what it will take to respond to those crises, and they put a number on it. And this is where we are right now in December for the Global Humanitarian Appeals for 5 of the countries in which War Child Canada is currently operating. So for example, Yemen right now, 30% funded. Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, 30% funded. South Sudan, 50% funded. Afghanistan, 30% funded. Sudan, 30% funded. Sudan. 7 million people have been displaced. More than 10,000 have died just since April. Our staff spent most of the summer, we have dozens of staff in Darfur, in El Janina, hiding because they were from the ethnic minority that was being targeted by the current RSF forces. And I'm not going to mince words here. This reality, this crisis, represents the greatest existential threat not only to our organization in the last 25 years, but to millions of war-affected civilians who are at grave risk right now in the world because their anguish simply is not generating the kind of donor investment and interest that they urgently need. And it doesn't have to be this way. We are in all of these places as an organization, and we are ready to do what we do well. But the resources are not there. And here's what that means in real terms. So a few weeks ago, I returned from Yemen, which is an area, as mentioned, that is about 30% funded and that is in desperate need of support. And these are global numbers, not our budget numbers, but global numbers in terms of the amount of money that's available. Yemen has the second highest risk of famine in the world after Somalia, which is where I started during the famine in Somalia straight out of medical school almost 30 years ago. And while in Yemen, I met a young boy by the name of Abdullah. He was 12 years old and living in a camp for internally displaced people in an area that War Child is actively targeting for our education programming. His mother died during the war, and this little boy was so physically stunted from chronic malnutrition that he's 12 and he's about this big. He looks roughly 8. And Abdullah lost his arm very recently and had burn marks across his face and his chest and his thighs and metal shrapnel embedded under parts of his skin. And he had lost his right arm as well. And what had happened in his particular situation, and this is a far too common story in places like Yemen, but his family is very poor. They're internally displaced. And they depended on UN food rations that were being given to them every single month. And because of these cutbacks, because of the 30% funded, the UN food program had to cut back those food rations to roughly twice a year. And so as a result, they had this young boy, Abdullah, going out every single day to scavenge piles of garbage to collect things that he could find to sell so that they could afford to feed him and to feed their families. And one afternoon, while this young boy was out scavenging a pile of garbage, he came across a box that was a munitions box. And he thought that this would be a windfall for the family if what was in there was still unused and he could resell it. And so he picked up a rock and he started pounding the lock on the box. And then it blew up, claiming his right arm, half of his jaw, part of his chest, and his thigh. And he was very lucky to survive. And if Abdullah had been able to go to school, to attend school of the kind that we want to be able to offer in that community, and we are targeting, as I said, this community for our catch-up learning and school rehabilitation programming, that is a safe environment for him. He wouldn't have been out there that day. And he would have been able to receive high-protein biscuits that are distributed in the schools every single day. And this wouldn't have happened. And immediately after Abdullah shared his story, a young woman came in to us with her 1-year-old daughter who was, without exaggeration, hours away from starving to death, so emaciated and skeletal. And I haven't seen that since Somalia. And normally I don't do clinical work in the field, but when a child is dying in front of you, you do what you got to do, right? And listening to her heartbeat, which was very slow and very languid, we knew that we didn't have a lot of time, and we ended up arranging for her to be transported to a local hospital. Her older sister, who was a toddler, had recently passed away from famine. And the truth is, her mother, who was on the verge of losing her second child to malnutrition and starvation, if we had the resources to run, for example, some of our women's education work and our longer-term food security work in this particular part of the country, if we had the resources, this mother and many mothers like her and their children would not be losing their families to starvation. These outcomes, these tragedies are entirely avoidable. And when you're supporting our work, that's what you are investing in. The last few months have certainly been among the most difficult and challenging of my professional career. I have watched with absolute revulsion as even more heinous atrocities have been systemically committed against women and girls. As someone who's been doing this work for a very long time in different war zones and who has confronted a lot of armed groups in my day, and I have certainly experienced more threats of sexual violence as a woman in those environments than sometimes it is possible to even count. But hearing those stories and listening to them, I feel their anguish and their fear very, very viscerally. I understand it because I have lived it. I have lived the terror of bombs dropping while buildings shake, while gunfire erupts, where there is no path out and no safe exit. War sticks with you forever. And I said at the start that I don't think I need to make the case any longer for why war should matter to all of us, regardless of where we live in the world. The evidence now is all around us. We can no longer run from it, and we can no longer shut ourselves off. And so the only real case that still must be made is, well, what can we do about it? But by being here this evening, you are already, all of you, doing something. And so now let's do more together, because we need you. The world needs you. You wouldn't be here tonight if you were not the rare people who care enough to show up for the overlooked victims of war, who are unafraid to take a principled stand, and who are willing to invest in a global vision of compassion and understanding. And surely the world needs a lot more of that right now. So please join us in that effort. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Honestly, I'm truly grateful, and I'm so humbled. There is nothing that invigorates, I know, not just me, but all of us who work at War Child Canada more than a room full of people who get it and who are willing to show up for what we do. I'm so profoundly grateful.